Good morning. It is Wednesday, the 12th of October, and we continue with our exploration of the book in the Old Testament, the book of the prophet Jonah. And yesterday we began. Today we've gone all the way through to the end of chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 10. There are only 10 verses in that chapter, and we began our reading this morning from the very last verse of chapter 1, verse 17. And the story thus far is that God has given Jonah, the prophet, he was a real prophet, and he had given him a command to go to the enemy town of Nineveh and to preach to them and to lead them to repentance. And Jonah runs away, and he disobeys God, and he does so by jumping on a ship. The ship experiences the most incredible storm. It's about to sink. And Jonah realizes that this is all a punishment of God. This is all the consequence from God of his behavior. And so he says to the sailors, throw me overboard and all will be well. And the sailors don't want to do that because this would be tantamount to manslaughter. Eventually they do, and they offer all sorts of sacrifices and prayers to this God of Jonah, seeking forgiveness. Which is interesting because these are Gentile sailors, and it was Jonah running away from preaching to the Gentiles. And Jonah is thrown into the sea, where he, in his prayer, which is the most part of chapter 2, he prays and he seeks forgiveness, and he says how he had sunk down to the very bottom of the earth, to the roots of the mountains, seaweed wrapped around his head. He should, by all accounts, be dead. He had disobeyed God. He was doomed. He was facing punishment from God. All of this in the prayer. And then we are told God sends a great fish. And interestingly, the word used is exactly that, of a great fish. It's not a word for the whale. There was a word in Hebrew for whale, and that was not used. There was also words for the great serpent of the sea, Leviathan, and that was also not used, nor any of the other words that might be simply interpreted as monsters of the deep. It was nothing more than a great fish. And this brings us back to what I was saying yesterday, that there is a very great sense in which the way Jonah has written this is to be some form of a teaching. And so it's not necessarily chronological and all truthful. It's written in a way that would somehow give an extra message. And for me, this comes through in that prayer of Jonah in chapter 2. The prayer, and I'd go so far as to say, perhaps it's a kind of soliloquy. It's a little message that Jonah uses. It's no doubt a valid prayer, but it's also designed to teach the listeners, to be a bridge for the listeners of kind of summary of what has happened so far and where they're going. It's in fact a teaching of the forgiveness and the love, the grace that God offers us. And in a sense, that's really the message, that when we disobey God and run away from what he asks us to do, there will be consequences. And those consequences will be brought about by God himself directly on our lives, perhaps, or also by other people. And so you see the sailors who are Gentiles who inflict this punishment on Job, and not Job, on Jonah. And of course, Jonah acknowledges this in his prayer. He says, God, you caused those sailors to throw me overboard. And of course, we know that actually it was Jonah convincing the people to throw him overboard. So there's a way in which I believe Jonah is giving us a message in this prayer. Valid prayer, seeking God's forgiveness, but also giving us a message and saying, God, you will save when we call upon you. But let us not have to get to that point. Let us rather obey you in what you ask us to do. So, dear friends, what is God asking you to do? Do it to the best of your ability. Ask for God's help if you're not too sure what to do, but don't run away. Don't ignore it, because God has asked you, because he knows you can do it. Let God do it. Folks, have a wonderful day, and we'll chat again tomorrow. God bless.